interpreter. And I wanted to thank you for volunteering for First Grade Science Day. We're going to demonstrate the experiment called Density of Liquids. The purpose of this experiment is to prove and explain that some liquids are denser than others. We will demonstrate this by showing how food coloring moves differently through a liquid depending upon its density. And then we'll also suspend some objects in different liquids and talk about what happens there. Before you begin the experiment with the students, you might want to have some carpet time and talk to them about water. And even though you might have a glass of water that is sitting still, the molecules are still moving, and we'll see that when we use the food coloring. When you add a drop of food coloring to a glass of water, the food coloring will disperse through the water, making beautiful streamers. This occurs because water is in constant motion and pushes the water molecules in the food coloring into motion. When you add food coloring to liquid that is more or less dense with water, the result will be different. So the first thing you want to do at the experiment table is set out 3 cups in front of each child. We're going to fill 2 of these with water and 1 with oil. So will you go ahead and put them about half full of water, 2 of them please, and I'll fill this one half full of oil. Okay, go ahead. In the refrigerator. Now, we're going to also use corn syrup, but for right now, we're going to use just the oil. The important thing is when you clean up from this experiment, please make sure you use any oil mixtures and dispose of them in the empty jugs that we'll provide for you. We can't put any oil down the drain. So for part 1 of the experiment, we're going to just look at 1 cup, half a cup of water. What you want to make sure first is, and you might want to have the water ready ahead of time, is you want to give the water some time to just be perfectly still so that it looks like nothing's moving at all. And once the water is completely still, you'll have some food coloring. And we're going to pretend that the water is still just so our video isn't too long here. We're going to add just 1 drop of food coloring, and even if the water is still, we will find that things move around. Now, here we go. So, it might be hard to see on the camera, but the children will be able to very easily see how the food coloring disperses through the water, and have them describe what is happening. The food coloring should begin to mix with the water as the water is in constant motion, and the food coloring and the water have the same density. Watch for several minutes, and while they're doing this, you want to make sure that the children don't stir the water or bump the table. So that's part 1. Part 2, we're going to work with salt water. So we have another cup that's partially full with water, and will you go get me a spoon, please? And we're going to put several spoons full of salt, and stir that up. And my helper is going to stir this up. Go ahead and stir it. Let me put a little bit more. You want to have plenty of salt in there. So we're going to stir that in, and then we're going to let it rest a minute until it's perfectly stopped. Take our spoon out. And what we're going to talk about then is what's going to happen. What do they think will happen when we put a drop of food coloring in here? So what do you think will happen? Do you think it'll be the same thing as before?
No, it'll be like blue.
Okay, well let's see. Let's take our red food coloring and let's drop in here. So do you think the food coloring will go through the water like before?
No.
Okay, let's see what happens. My food coloring is a little bit empty. There we go. Let's see what happens. What's happening, Lindsay? Is it falling to the bottom?
No.
What's happening?
It's going around in circles.
Yeah, the food coloring will float at the top of the water. water. That's why you make sure you use a lot of salt. Salt water is more dense, or it's heavier than water. So the water in the food coloring will float on top. In this instance, the colored water will float on salt water. So that's part 2. Part 1, part 2. In part 3, we're going to have a little bit of oil. This is in our cup. And again, we want to make sure the oil is still, and we're going to add a different color of food coloring. And you should have 2 colors of food coloring for your experiment. You will have 2 colors. So, what do you think is going to happen?
It's going to float on the top like
Okay,
the
she
water.
thinks it's going to float on the top like it did with the salt water. So let's find out. What happened?
It sinked down.
Yeah, did it spread out at all?
No.
Did it float at all?
No.
No. The drop of food coloring will remain a drop at the top of the oil and then slowly sink to the bottom. Oil and water don't mix. Water is denser than oil. So eventually, the small drop of colored water will sink to the bottom of the cup. That was part 3. So part 4, we're now going to work with corn syrup. So we're going to take our big cup, because we're going to layer some liquids here in a moment, and we're going to fill it about 1/3 full of corn syrup. And then each child is going to get 3 grapes. Can you get the grapes, please? Now, before we put the grapes in, we want to ask them, do you think that the grapes will float or sink in the syrup? What do you think?
It will float.
Okay. So what we're going to do, how about you think in the water?
It would sink.
And how about in the oil?
It would sink.
Okay. So she thinks they're going to sink in all 3 places. So each child is going to drop 1 grape into the cup of water. Go ahead. 1 grape into the cup of corn syrup. No, not the salt water, just the corn syrup. And 1 grape into the cup of oil. And you can talk about in which liquid does the grape float and which liquid does it sink.
This sink just as I said, and this one sink just as I said, and this one floated just as I said.
Okay. Objects will sink or float depending upon their density in relation to the density of the liquid that they're sitting in. If the density of an object is greater than a liquid's density, like our cooking oil, it will sink. If the object's density is less than a liquid's density, like the corn oil, it will float. Now, so then for part 5, I'm going to take this grape out, just for now. We may want it again, we may not. Because we're going to layer our liquids. So, we're going to take our syrup, corn syrup, we're going to slowly pour in the water. We don't want to get the grape in there, so slowly pour in the water. Good. And then we're going to slowly pour in the oil. Okay. Now, you want to have the children describe what they see happening. Density is one of the things that makes things float. The 3 liquids float on top of one another because they have different densities. The syrup should go to the bottom of the cup since it's the densest. The oil is the least dense, so it should go to the top. The water will go to the middle. The drop of food coloring from the oil experiment in part 3, if it goes in, we left it in there. But if your oil drops in, or if your food coloring drops in there, it will be in the middle of the 2 liquids. So, now we're going to give each person a paper clip, a piece of macaroni, and for our purposes today we just have some pasta, some angel hair pasta, and a button. Do we have a button? Oh, we gotta go find a button. Run upstairs and get a button. And what we're gonna do is drop them into the cup. Go ahead and drop them into the cup, the big cup. Go ahead. And she's gonna bring a button here in a moment. And what we're gonna talk about is that objects will float at different levels depending upon their density in relation to the density of the different liquids. If the density of an object is greater than a liquid's density, it will sink. If it's less than the liquid's density, it will float.
Here and the pasta's right here.
Okay. And we'll let you find out when you do the experiment where the button lands. Thank you very much. Have a great day.